The winter wind that swept through Carrick Hollow in 1894 carried the scent of coal dust and scorched timber, though the flames had long died out. The Whitlock home sat blackened against the gray hills, its skeletal beams still weeping steam into the air. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, reluctant to come closer, their eyes fixed on what the fire had spared. Inside, under the collapsed roof, lay the bodies of Thomas Whitlock, his wife Margaret, and their 3 youngest children. Their clothes were singed, their skin darkened to the hue of candle wax left too close to a flame, yet no part of them had burned away. Not a limb missing, not a finger curled by heat. They lay in twisted postures as though startled awake, mouths half open, eyes glistening faintly as if dampness lingered. The fire chief, a man who had pulled charred remains from dozens of mine explosions, muttered that he had never seen the like, that fire had passed over them without touching their flesh, as though it had wanted only what lay within. When the undertaker, Elias Brandt, came to retrieve them, he found their skin strangely cool despite the embers around them still glowing. He pressed his thumb into Thomas Whitlock's forearm and felt no give. The muscle beneath was rigid, yet the skin had a faint greasy sheen as if oiled from the inside. The eyes, when he tried to close them, resisted, the lids snapping back as though some invisible pressure pushed from within. Brandt told no one about the eyes. The burial was hurried. Closed coffins, nailed tight, lowered into the frozen ground before the week was out. The priest's words hung awkwardly over the grave, for even he could not bring himself to say they had been returned to ash. The mine workers whispered to one another in low tones, repeating an old scrap of immigrant folklore, that some souls refused the flame, clinging to the earth in their bodies like a wasp in its paper nest. In the weeks that followed, the Whitlock property drew the curious and the frightened alike. Neighbors swore the soil where the house had stood steamed even in the cold, and that no snow would settle on its blackened foundation. Children dared one another to walk the ashes barefoot, only to come running back pale, claiming the ground pulsed faintly under their heels, like a heartbeat. In the tavern, old miner Pavel Verzos leaned across his beer to tell the younger men that there were ways to pull heat from a living body without burning it. A skill from the old country, once used to keep a rival's corpse from decomposing so his spirit would never rise. He would say no more, and the younger men laughed it off, though uneasily. The sheriff made a quiet visit to the remains of the house himself, turning over charred beams with his boot. In the center of what had been the sitting room, he found a patch of floorboards unburned, though everything around them had been reduced to black flakes. The boards were smooth and pale, and when he knelt, he saw tiny pinpricks along their length as though something had dripped onto them in a perfect measured pattern. He touched one of the dots and found it brittle, flaking into fine red powder between his fingers. That night he placed the powder in a tin and locked it in his desk, though he would not live to explain why. In church, whispers about the Whitlock fire took on a new shape. Margaret Whitlock had been known to keep a small locked cabinet, and more than one woman claimed to have seen her son Elias, the surviving eldest, carrying heavy jars from the cellar on the night of the blaze. Elias, for his part, spoke little after the fire. He walked the streets at dusk, his face pale, his eyes unreadable, and though his lips did not move, children claimed they could hear him speaking when he passed. The voice was low, hollow, and not quite his own. By the end of winter, Carrick Hollow had come to accept the official story, that the Whitlocks had been overcome by smoke and spared the indignity of burning. But in the minds of those who had seen the bodies, that explanation never held. Something in the way the skin had glistened, the eyes had resisted, and the air around them had stayed cool while the house fell in flames. All of it lingered like an unclosed door in the mind. And in the shadows of the slag heaps where the wind tunneled between the hills, Elias Whitlock listened to those doubts and began to shape them into something he could use. The thaw came late to Carrick Hollow that year, and when it did, the slag heaps bled black water into the gullies. It was in this wet season that Elias Whitlock began to walk at night. People saw him from their windows, his thin figure moving along the ridge of the coal mounds, silhouetted against the moon. At first they thought grief had made him restless, but soon the stories changed. Elias, they said, could be heard speaking even when his lips were still. It was a sound that came from deep in his chest, as if his breath moved inward instead of out, a low, steady voice that carried farther than a whisper should. Miners on the night shift told of him appearing without sound behind them, reciting phrases they could not understand. The words were heavy with something old, a rhythm like a prayer but sharper, more deliberate, as if measuring and cutting invisible threads. No one could explain how the boy knew such words. It was old Pavel Verzos who gave the first name to it. He said Elias spoke of the hollowing, a way to take the heat from a body without flame. Pavel would not explain how he knew the term, but those who pressed him found his eyes turn distant, as if he were looking at something far behind the person speaking. The hollowing, he muttered once, leaves a person looking alive for longer than they should, keeps the softness in their eyes, the dampness in their mouth, but nothing inside warms. The story might have been dismissed as tavern talk if not for what began happening to the children. It was gradual. Mothers would wake to find their sons and daughters murmuring in their sleep, mouths closed but voices moving through them in low tones. Some children recited the same odd syllables Elias was known to speak. Others whispered the names of neighbors long dead. The priest called it a sickness of the nerves brought on by grief, but there was no fever, no pain. Only the strange hollow murmuring and the way the air around the children felt just a degree cooler than the rest of the room. Elias himself avoided the main street during daylight, choosing the narrow footpaths behind the houses, his hands often hidden in his coat pockets even when the weather had turned warm. Those who saw his face up close remarked on the change in his eyes. They no longer held the watery innocence of a boy, but something fixed and steady, as though they were not watching the world but measuring it. He began visiting the slag heaps more often, sometimes standing for hours near the vents where steam rose from the ground, the vapor curling around him like breath returning to the earth. One night, the sheriff, who had kept the tin of reddish powder from the Whitlock fire, claimed to see Elias crouch near one of these vents, holding something small in his hands. The moonlight caught the object. A bird, limp but unburned, its feathers stiff as though frozen. Elias lowered the bird into the vent, and though the steam swirled around it, the feathers did not dampen or curl. When Elias stood, he looked toward the sheriff without surprise, as if expecting him, and then walked away. The voice inside his chest murmuring something the sheriff could not bring himself to repeat. By summer, the miners had taken to crossing themselves when Elias passed. His presence at the mouth of the mine seemed to lower the air's warmth, as if the sunlight dimmed slightly while he stood there. The Dr. Harmon Locke began making quiet notes in his ledger about the boy's peculiar effect on living things. A field mouse caught under a tin trap was found beneath Elias's boot without so much as a mark. Its tiny heart had stopped mid-beat, yet its eyes gleamed wet and clear. Locke told no one, though he found himself increasingly drawn to watch Elias from a distance, not with suspicion but with a kind of dark fascination. Carrick Hollow was not a town for superstition. Its people lived by coal and iron, not omens. But the sense that something was being learned, practiced, and refined in their midst began to press against the town like an unseen weight. And Elias Whitlock, the boy who never seemed to breathe, moved through their streets like a shadow with its own voice, already deciding whose warmth he would take next. Dr. Harmon Locke had been Carrick Hollow's physician for nearly 20 years, long enough to see the town through mine cave-ins, influenza waves, and the slow wasting sickness that took the old. He kept his hands clean, his voice steady, and his notes private. But when Elias Whitlock began to occupy his thoughts, Locke's ledger, a leather-bound volume with a broken clasp, started to fill with entries that bore no resemblance to ordinary medicine. It began with animals. The first note was about a sheep found lying in a pasture on the edge of town. Its wool was clean, no scorch marks, no wounds. When Locke examined it, the animal's organs were gone, its chest cavity smooth and empty, but the skin intact and unbroken. The smell was faint, not of rot or fire, but of damp earth after rain. Days later, he recorded a frog experiment. The frog had been placed in a bowl of water. It breathed, moved, and then stilled, but its skin remained fresh. When Locke dissected it, he found the tissues dry inside, the veins collapsed as though they had been emptied of something essential. There were no cuts, no signs of extraction, yet the body seemed hollowed. Locke's handwriting changed in these entries, growing tighter, as if trying to compress something unspeakable into the lines. He noted Elias's choice of animals with unsettling precision. A sheep, symbol of innocence and sacrifice. A frog, a creature that moves between water and land. Later a crow taken from the churchyard, its black feathers polished and eyes still moist days after death. The selections matched fragments of folk superstition Locke remembered from his medical school years. Whispers from older European students about the symbolic vocabulary of death. Each life taken was not random but part of a language, each body a word, each hollowing a sentence in some ritual being written. The more Locke observed, the more he saw that Elias was deliberate in his timings. The boy seemed to choose nights when the wind blew from the east, or when the moon was hidden, or when coal dust hung thick in the air after a long shift in the mines. He never took two lives the same way in succession and never left remains where the pattern could be too easily traced. But Locke noticed something else. Elias was learning. The first hollowed bodies had a slight shriveling at the extremities, but over weeks even that disappeared. His technique was evolving toward perfection. Locke did not tell the sheriff or the priest. Instead, he made sketches in the ledger, diagrams of imagined tools that could extract heat or moisture or something less tangible from the living without leaving a wound. He drew pipes and funnels, glass tubes with narrow throats, stones heated to a specific color, though he had never seen such things in Elias's hands. At night, in the quiet of his study, Locke sometimes wondered if he was inventing them himself, or if Elias had planted the ideas in his mind simply by speaking the right words in that deep, hollow voice. By autumn, the ledger held 27 entries. The last was the most disturbing. A miner found in his bunk, his eyes open and mouth parted slightly as if about to speak. His skin was cool, his body rigid, but when Locke touched his cheek, a faint dampness clung to his fingers. The miner's lungs were empty, yet the back of his throat glistened as though he had just swallowed. Locke wrote in the margin, "Moisture remains. Suggests the process is incomplete. Deliberate?" He realized then that Elias might not be killing simply to preserve. He might be keeping something in suspension, holding it between life and death for reasons not yet visible. Locke began locking the ledger in his desk at night, but the act gave him no comfort. More than once he woke in the dark to the sense that someone had been standing in his study, reading by the thin light of the dying hearth. In the morning, the ledger would be exactly where he had left it, but the clasp would be open. And in his mind, without moving his lips, he thought he could hear Elias say, "You're learning." The first time it happened, people thought the weather had played a trick. On a windless night in late October, chimneys across Carrick Hollow began releasing a pale blue smoke, though no fires burned within the stoves. It drifted upward in steady, unbroken streams, shimmering faintly in the moonlight before vanishing into the black sky. By morning, the town's talk was uneasy but not yet afraid. They called it cold damp, a miner's superstition, and let the matter rest. But the second time, a week later, the blue smoke came heavier, curling low over the rooftops until it clung to the ground like fog. People woke choking, their throats raw, yet their lungs showed no soot, no inflammation, as though the irritation had come from within. In the Dunn household, the eldest daughter, Clara, stumbled into the kitchen unable to speak, her tongue pale and shriveled like paper. The doctor could find no burn, no lesion, no reason for her sudden loss of voice. In 3 other homes that same night, families complained of a metallic taste on their tongues and an ache in their chests that faded as quickly as it came. The only thing that lingered was a coldness deep in the body, an absence of warmth no blanket could cure. Whispers began about Elias. He had been seen at dusk, standing at the edge of several properties, motionless except for the way his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. His eyes reflected lamplight with a sheen too steady to be natural, like the glass eyes of a doll. People swore they had watched him move from one house to the next, stopping at each chimney before walking on. The pattern was too deliberate to be chance. Dr. Locke, already burdened by what his ledger held, began to see the outlines of a technique. If Elias could draw heat from a body without flame, perhaps he had found a way to siphon it from many at once, using the chimneys as channels. The idea was absurd by the laws of science, yet the symptoms were real. Locke kept his suspicions to himself, writing instead in his ledger that the town might be under a form of controlled environmental stress. But his private sketches told another story. Crude diagrams of hollowed lungs, the branching flues of chimneys overlaid on the branching of airways, arrows showing movement not of smoke, but of something unseen flowing outward. The third night of blue chimneys came without warning. The air was dry and brittle, the moon shrouded by thin cloud. From the ridge the town looked as if 100 ghostly fires burned at once, each chimney spilling its pale smoke into the sky. But inside the houses, fires sat cold in their grates. People woke to find frost on the inside of their window panes and their own breath curling out in clouds, though the air was still. In one home, the body of Michael Hargreave was found slumped in his chair, his skin untouched by burn, his eyes open and wet. His wife swore she had seen Elias in the yard earlier that evening, his face upturned toward the chimney, his hands deep in his pockets as though holding something warm against the cold. By morning, the council declared it a problem of the mine's ventilation system, a matter for the engineers. They spoke the lie firmly with the force of men who needed to believe it, but among themselves in low voices they admitted the truth. This was not gas, nor smoke, nor anything they could measure. It was a taking, and the taker was still walking their streets. Locke noticed a new entry forming in his own thoughts before he even set pen to paper. The victims were never fully drained. Their bodies retained just enough warmth to remain supple, their eyes wet, their mouths damp. It was as if Elias was collecting something in increments, unwilling to finish the work in a single act. This made the town's fear worse, for it meant the work was ongoing. That winter, people began keeping their chimneys blocked at night, fires unlit, choosing the cold over the unseen touch of the blue smoke. Yet even without the chimneys open, some swore they woke to the faint smell of iron in their throats and the memory of a low voice murmuring from within their own chest. And in the morning, they would see footprints in the frost outside their door, leading away toward the slag heaps, each step clean and dry as though no snow had ever touched them. The first body was found in the snow behind the old rail depot, half buried beneath a drift. At a glance it appeared whole, untouched, the pale face almost peaceful. But when Dr. Locke rolled back the sleeve, he saw the skin stretched tight over the arm, the veins beneath standing out in strange, looping patterns. They did not swell with blood but lay flat as though empty, their lines curving and crossing in a deliberate lattice. Where the veins met, the skin puckered slightly, forming tiny knots as if sewn from the inside with an invisible thread. There was no incision, no puncture. It was as if the blood had been drawn out through the flesh itself and the vessels tied closed without a hand ever breaking the skin. Within a week, 2 more bodies surfaced. One in a frozen ditch near the Whitlock property, another in the loft of an abandoned barn. Each showed the same intricate stitching beneath the skin, each preserved without decay despite the mild thaw. When Locke opened one of the corpses in private, what he found unnerved him. The internal organs were intact in shape but transformed. The heart collapsed into a husk that crumbled at his touch. The liver reduced to a granular dust the color of dried blood. It was not rot. It was something else, a reduction of living tissue into fine matter without heat or flame. The sheriff called it a grotesque act of mutilation, but Locke knew it was something more exacting, more methodical. These were not random killings. The arrangement of the knots in the veins reminded him of anatomical drawings, but also of embroidery patterns he had once seen in a European folk museum. Designs meant to bind a thing, to hold it still in place. He began sketching the vein patterns in his ledger, overlaying them with the symbols Elias had once whispered to the children in their sleep. The similarities were too precise to ignore. The town buried the bodies quickly, but the preservation unsettled the gravediggers. Days after burial, when the frost heave pushed at the ground, the corpses looked as though they might rise if the soil were brushed away. Their skin had not sagged or dried, their eyes still pooled with moisture. The undertaker reported a faint resistance when closing the lids, the same resistance Brant had noted with the Whitlocks. By late November, fear in Carrick Hollow took on a new shape. People began checking their own veins for knots, pressing at the skin for signs of unnatural patterning. The illness was no longer imagined as something you caught. It was something done to you, something sewn in place. Mothers forbade their children from going near the slag heaps where Elias was often seen standing with his head bowed, hands deep in his coat pockets. Yet somehow his reach extended. One victim, an elderly miner named Calder, had been bedridden for weeks and never left his house. Still, when he died, his veins were bound in the same unnatural lattice. Locke wrestled with a growing certainty. This was not merely preservation. The sewing of the veins, the transformation of blood into dust, the refusal of the flesh to rot. All of it suggested an attempt to halt something in the body. Not death exactly, but the departure of something vital, something Elias seemed determined to keep tethered. The body in Elias's hands became not a corpse, but a container. On the coldest night of the season, Locke awoke to the sensation of someone standing beside his bed. He opened his eyes to see only the dark, but in the dim glow of the dying fire he thought he saw the faint outline of Elias's figure, head tilted, watching him. The room felt heavy, the air pressing. Down and in his own chest he felt a strange tightening, as if the blood in his veins was being threaded together. In the morning he found a single red fleck on his pillow, no larger than a grain of sand. He locked it away in the tin with the reddish powder from the Whitlock fire, though he knew it was not the same. This dust was warmer. The snow had only just begun to soften when the call came from a pair of boys who had been exploring the back fields beyond the hollow. They had found a farmhouse, one that hadn't been lived in for years, its windows boarded but its front door ajar. Inside, the air was dry and faintly sweet, like flowers pressed between old pages. What they saw sent them running for the sheriff. A table stretched nearly the length of the main room, draped in a yellowing cloth. On each plate rested not food, but an organ, a heart, a liver, a pair of lungs, each pale and perfect, their surfaces slick as though freshly taken. Beside each organ was a small glass decanter, each filled with a clear liquid that caught the light in subtle hues of blue and green when the sun moved across the cracks in the boards. There were places set for 20 guests, though the head of the table sat empty, its plate bare. Dr. Locke arrived before the bodies could be touched. The organs were warm, impossibly so given the chill outside. None bore cuts or signs of removal. The tissue had separated from its body with a kind of surgical absence, as though the bodies they once belonged to had willingly let them go. The clear liquid in the decanters smelled faintly of stone after rain. Locke dipped the tip of his finger into one and touched it to his tongue. For a heartbeat, the taste was nothing, and then the image came. Margaret Whitlock, seated at her old kitchen table, looking straight ahead, her eyes wet and fixed on something far away. The vision was gone in an instant, but Locke stumbled back, his stomach tightening. The sheriff wanted to burn the table, burn the house, burn every decanter and plate. But when they tried to set flame to the cloth, the fire hissed and died, leaving the fabric unmarked. The wood beneath was dry, the tinder good, but nothing would catch. In the end, they boarded the farmhouse and posted a man to guard it, though he lasted only 2 nights before abandoning his post, claiming he could hear voices laughing softly from inside. Rumors spread quickly. The old women spoke of an unbound wedding, a ritual in which the living and the dead were bound through a shared meal. The absence of the bride, signifying the union, was not yet complete. Drinking the liquid, they said, would let you see the face of the dead who waited for you, though it would cost you your voice. Locke wrote the superstition down, but his mind stayed on the taste, the vision, the dampness in Margaret's eyes. He knew then that Elias's work was no longer just about hollowing bodies. It was about bridging something, keeping the dead present in a form that could be served, shared, consumed. That night, a thin fog rolled into the hollow, clinging to the houses like damp cloth. The next morning, Elias was seen walking the main road, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his eyes scanning the houses as though counting the people inside. He carried nothing, yet Locke noticed the boy's pockets sagging slightly, as if weighted by something dense and warm. The farmhouse sat silent for weeks after, the boards over its windows swelling with frost. But those who lived nearby claimed they could smell the sweetness on certain nights, carried on a wind that did not touch the rest of the town. And in the Whitlock plot at the cemetery, the ground began to sink in a narrow line, as though something beneath had shifted. The coal cellar beneath Dr. Locke's practice was a place he rarely entered, a low stone chamber where the dust never truly settled and the air held the faint taste of iron. He found Elias there one evening in early spring, seated on an overturned crate, the dim light from a single lantern casting deep hollows into his face. Around him, lining the walls, were shelves improvised from old boards, and upon them jars, dozens of them, each holding a heart suspended in a pale gelatin that caught the lantern glow like cloudy glass. None were shriveled, none discolored. They floated as if asleep, their vessels trailing like roots into the geel. Elias did not look up at Locke at first. His gaze was fixed on a jar nearest to him where a heart rested perfectly still, its surface smooth, the veins faintly blue beneath the sheen. When he finally spoke, it was in that same deep, chest-borne voice that seemed not to pass his lips at all. He told Locke he was keeping them from fire, that when the body burned or rotted, the heat inside escaped and was lost forever. The heart, he said, was the true vessel of that heat, and if preserved, the person could be held in place, neither gone nor living, only bound. Locke's mind raced between horror and a grim, reluctant curiosity. The jars were not simply trophies. The arrangement on the shelves followed a pattern, largest to smallest, left to right, the pale gelatin thickening slightly in the final jars as though Elias was refining the formula. Some jars were labeled in careful handwriting, dates and names, many of them recent disappearances the town still whispered about. When Locke asked why the preservation mattered, Elias tilted his head in a way that made him look far older than his years. The binding science, he called it, older than any medicine, a discipline meant to cheat the burning of the soul. He spoke of a final vessel, something not yet prepared, a body that would hold the collected heat of many. Locke could feel the cellar air growing warmer as Elias described it, the lantern flame bending slightly toward the boy as though drawn. There was no plea for secrecy, no threat. Only the quiet expectation that Locke would understand, would perhaps even assist. And in some dark recess of himself, Locke felt the pull. He imagined the texture of the gelatin, the precision of the vessel work, the way the heart seemed to refuse time. When Elias rose to leave, he passed close enough for Locke to smell the faint sweetness of the farmhouse feast still lingering on his coat. The boy's footsteps were near silent, but the warmth remained after he had gone, radiating from the jars as if the hearts inside still knew they had been seen. The winter of 1895 came down like a lid over Carrick Hollow, the snow flattening the hills and muting the sound of the mine whistles. It was in this muffled silence that people began to vanish. At first, a pair of miners failed to return from a shift, then a seamstress on her way home from the evening train, then a boy sent to fetch water from the well. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, only the last witness each time saying they had seen the missing walking with Elias Whitlock toward the black mouth of the number 4 mine. The strange thing was the calm. Those taken had not been dragged or coerced. They walked alongside him as if already convinced. Days later, the bodies began to appear. They were found upright, standing along the slopes above the hollow, arranged in uneven rows that stretched toward the slag heaps. Snow had frozen in their hair, clung to their lashes and crusted along their collars, yet their skin showed no frostbite. Their eyes were open and wet, the lips parted slightly as though they were listening. The postures were not random. One man held his hands clasped in front of him. A woman tilted her head in a fixed, mournful angle. The arrangements reminded Locke of woodcut illustrations from a medieval manuscript he had once glimpsed in medical school. Images of the waiting procession, figures posed at the threshold of something unseen. That book, he recalled, had been destroyed in a fire at the university library. But now he wondered if it had truly burned at all. The townsfolk began avoiding the mine's approaches, but it made no difference. One evening, Locke saw Elias himself walking along the ridge, the snow breaking only where his boots pressed, the prints perfectly dry as though the snow beneath had been hardened to stone. Behind him trailed a girl of no more than 10, her bare head flecked with frost, her eyes locked on some distant point. When Locke shouted, neither turned. Sheriff Graves organized a search party, but each time they entered the mine, the cold inside grew unbearable, the air thick and metallic. Lantern flames weakened and sputtered as if choked by something invisible. No one stayed inside for long. When they emerged, they found fresh figures standing in the rows along the slopes as though they had been placed there while the searchers were underground. By March, the procession of hollowed bodies stretched far enough to be seen from the main road, a line of silent witnesses facing the town. And though the snow still fell, none of it settled on their faces. It was as if the air around them refused to let it touch. They took Elias Whitlock in the gray light before dawn, the sheriff's men surrounding him as he walked alone along the ridge above the mine. He did not resist nor speak, though those nearest claimed they could feel a faint warmth in the air around him, as though he carried the remnants of a fire hidden beneath his coat. The arrest drew the entire town to the courthouse, a squat brick building whose windows rattled in the winter wind. Inside, the benches were packed, the air close and heavy with the damp scent of wet wool. From the start, the trial felt wrong. The first juror to take his seat began coughing before the opening statements were read, his face pale and eyes watery. By the second day, 3 more jurors complained of a strange metallic taste in their mouths, and one collapsed during the sheriff's testimony, his pulse slow and thready, though his skin was cool and damp. Dr. Locke was called to examine him, but found no sign of seizure or fever, only a deep, still emptiness in the chest, as if the heart had forgotten its work. Witnesses spoke of the blue chimneys, the sown veins, the frozen processions, but Elias never looked at them. His gaze wandered the rafters as if following something that moved just beyond sight. When the prosecutor demanded to know what he had done with the missing, Elias's lips did not move. But a murmur seemed to pass through the room, rising from the floorboards themselves. Several in the gallery swore they heard their own names spoken in that low, hollow tone. On the 4th day, Judge Mallory began to read the morning docket but faltered mid-sentence. His eyes glazed, his mouth opened as though to speak, yet no words came. He slumped in his chair, his skin cool and unmarked, the moisture still clinging to his eyes. The gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Silence followed, a silence so complete it felt weighted, pressing down on every breath. The trial was abandoned. The council met in secret that night, deciding that Elias should be sent to the St. Hallowgate Asylum rather than kept in the town jail. Officially, he was diagnosed with consumptive mania and deemed unfit for execution. Unofficially, no one wanted to risk keeping him within the hollow. When the sheriff's men led him out under heavy guard, the crowd lining the street stood in utter stillness. Snow fell in wide, slow flakes, yet not a single one touched Elias's hair or coat. He walked with his head slightly bowed, the faintest curl of vapor rising from him as if he carried the breath of others still inside. St. Hallowgate Asylum stood on a barren hill 3 towns away, its stone walls blackened by years of rain and coal soot. The building had no gardens, no tree, only a wind-swept yard where the grass grew in uneven patches like hair on scarred skin. Elias Whitlock arrived in the dead of winter, led through iron gates that shut with a sound more final than any cell door. Official records show only his name, age, and the date of admission. No notes, no daily logs, no physician's signatures. For the first month, the asylum's staff reported nothing unusual. Elias was assigned to laundry duty, then to the mortuary, where he worked under the guise of preparing the dead for burial. But within weeks, attendants began to disappear. One orderly failed to return from the cellar after delivering fresh linens. Another was last seen carrying a tray of instruments toward the mortuary before supper. There were no bodies found, no signs of struggle, only the faint smell of damp stone in the empty rooms. Dr. Locke visited under the pretense of medical review. He found Elias in the mortuary, standing beside a row of patients laid out on narrow slabs. They were not covered, not embalmed. yet their skin was firm and cool, their eyes wet and open. A thin film of frost clung to the lashes of one man, though the room was warm from the coal stove. Locke realized with a jolt that these were not corpses as the staff believed. They were hollowed, standing in a suspended state somewhere between life and death. When Locke pressed Elias for an explanation, the boy only turned one of the slabs slightly so the light struck the patient's face. The expression was calm. The lips parted just enough to show a glisten of moisture inside. "They are waiting." Elias's voice came from deep within, though his lips did not move. "You keep them until they are ready." Locke left the asylum unsettled, but returned weeks later to find changes. A full wing had been sealed off, its windows bricked over. Staff avoided the corridor entirely, claiming it had been closed for renovations. Locke knew better. The air near the entrance was warm, carrying the same sweet scent that had lingered in the boarded farmhouse after the wedding feast. By spring, Hallowgate's official census listed 3 fewer patients than the winter before. But no deaths were recorded. Families were told their relatives had been transferred. No transfer records existed. Elias remained calm through it all, his presence as quiet as before. But Locke could feel the pull of something larger now. Something gathering in the hidden wing, bound and preserved for a purpose only Elias understood. When the trunk arrived, Locke was already an old man. It came without warning, delivered by a driver who claimed no knowledge of its sender, though the tag bore the neat, narrow script Locke recognized at once. E. Whitlock. The wood was blackened at the edges, the metal fittings cold even in the warmth of the study. Inside lay a collection of notebooks, each bound in cracked leather, their pages covered in precise handwriting and intricate diagrams. Alongside them were instruments unlike anything Locke had seen. Silver tubing no thicker than a quill, glass jars with veins of colored filament running through them, and stones of a dull, mottled gray, each with a faint heat that pulsed in the hand. The notebooks were clinical in tone, written not as confession but as instruction. They detailed the extraction of combustion from a living body, the ways in which heat could be drawn, stored, and recombined. The process was broken into stages: selection, preparation, hollowing, and binding. The final stage, integration, was only hinted at with diagrams of overlapping human forms and symbols Locke recognized from the sewn veins of the preserved dead. One section chilled him more than the rest. Elias had noted that the binding required the victim to be in a specific emotional state at the moment of hollowing: grief, regret, or unspoken love. These emotions, he wrote, keep the heat restless, unwilling to rise, easy to tether. Locke thought of the preserved hearts in the coal cellar, of the standing procession on the slopes, of the faces he had seen in the mortuary at Hallowgate. They had all worn the same expression, a kind of unfinished sorrow. There were sketches of rooms, long, narrow chambers lined with shelves of hearts in gelatin flanked by pipes running to a central vessel. A note in the margin read, "The vessel must be living. It must be willing." Locke's pulse quickened as he turned the pages, realizing that the gathered heat of many could be bound into one, creating something that would neither burn nor decay, a container for all that had been taken. The trunk also held small pouches of red granular dust, the same texture as the residue from the Whitlock fire, sealed with wax. Each was labeled with a name and date, some going back decades. Locke understood then that Elias had not stopped his work after Hallowgate, that the binding science had continued quietly, hidden in places no one thought to look. That night, Locke locked the trunk in his attic, though he felt the warmth of its contents through the floorboards above his bed. The knowledge inside was complete enough to be followed, and some part of him against his will felt the faint stirrings of temptation. In the summer of 1932, workmen repairing the foundation of Carrick Hollow's chapel struck something solid beneath the earth. At first they thought it was stone, but the shapes gave way to the outline of human forms. The dig revealed a mass grave, the bodies stacked with deliberate care, each wrapped in coarse cloth that had not rotted. When the coverings were peeled back, the workmen froze. The faces beneath were fresh, their skin cool and pliable, their eyes wet as though death had come only minutes before. Word spread quickly, drawing the townspeople to the chapel yard. Among the preserved was the Whitlock family, Thomas, Margaret, and their children, exactly as they had been found in the ruins of their home in 1894. There was no sign of decay, no odor of death, only the faint sweet scent Locke knew too well from the farmhouse feast and the sealed wing of St. Hallowgate. Some swore they saw the eyes of the youngest child shift slightly in the light, but no one dared lean closer to be sure. The council, unwilling to face what this meant, ordered the grave filled again. This time they poured a thick layer of cement over the bodies, the official reasoning being to protect them from disturbance. Privately, those who had stood at the edge of the pit knew the cement was to keep the living out, not the dead in. The priest refused to conduct a second burial service, claiming the souls had never truly left and that prayers would be wasted. Locke, now stooped with age, stood at the edge of the crowd, his mind circling the diagrams from Elias's notebooks. The arrangement of the bodies in the grave mirrored one of the sketches. A spiral, each form slightly angled toward the next, as though feeding their heat in a slow rotation. If the cement sealed them fully, the process might never complete, or it might keep building, waiting for a vessel strong enough to hold it. That night, Locke climbed to his attic and opened the trunk for the first time in years. The stones were still warm. The dust-filled pouches gave off a faint metallic tang. He thought of Elias's final note. The vessel must be living. It must be willing. He wondered whether Elias had intended the grave to be the final collection, whether the Whitlocks and the others were meant to rise again, bound into something that would not burn, would not rot, would not leave. The next morning, a thin crack appeared in the cement above the grave. No one spoke of it aloud, but by nightfall, half the town had walked past the chapel yard, each moving quickly, none looking directly at the mound. In the summer of 1974, a locked drawer in the Carrick Hollow courthouse was opened during renovations. Inside was Dr. Harmon Locke's ledger, its leather dry and flaking, the clasp long broken. The writing inside was tight and deliberate, each page filled with observations, sketches, and dates spanning decades. There were entries on the Whitlock fire, the blue chimneys, the sown veins, the procession on the slopes, and the unburning grave beneath the chapel. The final pages contained meticulous notes copied directly from Elias Whitlock's notebooks. Instructions for the binding science written in the same dispassionate tone one might use to describe surgery or chemistry. The discovery reached the county authorities, then the state. Pathologists pored over the diagrams, some dismissing them as the work of a delusional mind, others unsettled by how closely certain techniques resembled early unpublicized experiments in cryopreservation and organ storage, but without the use of cold. In private, a handful of medical historians admitted they could not explain the preservation of the Whitlock bodies in purely scientific terms. The cemetery records confirmed the cement layer still lay over the chapel grave. But the old caretaker whispered that each spring hairline cracks reappeared, no matter how many times they were sealed. The hollow itself had changed. The mine was long closed, the slag heaps overgrown, the houses leaning with age. Yet visitors to the Whitlock Memorial, a simple stone bearing no dates, only the family name, often reported hearing a faint murmur when the wind shifted. The sound had no source, seeming to pass through their chests rather than their ears. Some swore the voice spoke in their own language, no matter where they came from. Local law quietly forbade the exhumation of any grave in the chapel yard. A county ordinance passed without public explanation prohibited the sale or transport of combustive remains, a phrase that puzzled anyone who saw it printed in the legal code. The origin of that law lay buried in a closed meeting, the minutes sealed indefinitely. Locke's ledger was archived in a climate-controlled vault, but not before a handful of pages were copied. Those copies circulated quietly among certain academic and medical circles, always without attribution, as if speaking the names of Elias Whitlock or Carrick Hollow aloud might invite something unwelcome. The pages contained more than just procedures. They carried Elias's philosophy in terse, clinical sentences: fire wastes, decay wastes. To keep the heat is to keep the person, to bind is to protect. Among those who read it, opinions split. Some saw it as the work of a dangerous obsessive, an artifact of superstition dressed in scientific language. Others, particularly those working at the edges of life extension research, could not ignore the implications. If heat, whatever Elias truly meant by it, could be held in the body indefinitely, what might be possible? And at what cost? For the people of Carrick Hollow, the story was not history, but an ongoing presence. They lived with it in the silence of certain streets after dark, in the way fog sometimes pooled in the yard of the old Whitlock home even on clear days, in the knowledge that children still occasionally murmured strange words in their sleep. They avoided the chapel graveyard unless necessity drove them there, and when they did pass, they walked quickly, eyes forward, unwilling to look too long at the cement mound. The narrative had no neat ending, no signed confession, no official resolution. It persisted as a thing half-spoken, carried in the tone of the old, in the warnings of parents to children about walking alone at dusk. It was a reminder that not all legacies fade with time. Some lie bound in the earth, waiting, sustained by a science or ritual no one will admit to knowing. And so the question lingers uncomfortably close to the surface. If Elias Whitlock's work was truly about preservation, not for days, not for years, but forever, then where is the line between protection and possession? Between keeping someone safe from fire and keeping them for yourself? The answer, perhaps, is in the way evil survives. Not loudly, not in the open, but in silence, hidden behind the language of care, the pretense of science, the face of someone who seems to mean no harm. What do you think? Could this happen again?